Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at understanding and using the concepts of totaling and counting. We're also going to be looking at the concept of string handling, including the length of a string, substring, upper and lower. We're also going to be looking at the use of nested statements and what is meant by procedures, functions, and parameters. You'll need to define and use procedures and functions with or without parameters. And you should also develop your understanding of local and global variables, especially in relation to procedures and functions. So we're going to be looking at all of that in pseudocode. Okay, let's start with totaling. Totaling is adding together a set of values. And if you want to write a program to total something, you will first need to initialize the total variable to 0. Because if you don't have this total variable, there's no place in RAM to store the total. You then can add values together, either individually or within a loop. So if you look at the example on screen, we have assigned the value 0 to total. We then use a for loop, which has a counter which runs from 0 to 10. And then we're going to output, enter a number, and then get the users to input a number. This number is added to the total. And every time the counter moves up towards 10, we ask for a new number, and this new number is then added to the total. At the end, we simply output the total is and concatenate with the total variable. That's all there is to totaling. Initialize the total variable to 0 and then use a loop to add whatever value you want to add to the total variable. Now, counting works similarly. Counting is to check how many of something there are, and to write a program, you would need to initialize, just like total, a counter variable to 0, and then increment or decrement it depending on what you want to do. So you can add 1, add 10, add 2, or reduce 1, reduce 2, and so forth. So let's walk through the example on screen. The count variable is initialized to 0. We then set a flag which is continue, and we set it to yes. Why do we use a flag? Because we want to carry on counting until somebody says no. So while continue is equal to yes, which it is, we're going to do the following. We're going to output, do you want to continue? And then we're going to ask the user whether they want to continue or not using the continue variable. And every time the user answers, we increment the count variable by 1. And we keep doing it until the user enters no or something else. And then we output you continued and count minus 1. Why count minus 1? Because we are incrementing count after the continue. So when the last continue says no, it's still going to increment the continue variable. So take into account that little logic issue. We subtract 1 from the final count. Okay, let's look at string manipulation. A string is a piece of text, and this could be made up of characters, numbers, and symbols. There are lots of different types of string manipulation that you can use, and these let you alter strings, find values within strings, and so on. The two you need to know are length and substring for your exam. Length basically returns the number of characters in a string, and all you need to do is simply say length bracket a variable name or actual string. Like in this case, hi would return 2 because there are only 2 characters in hi. Now, just a word of warning, sometimes you'll be asked to check the length of a phrase. Space is counted as a character. So if you had hi space Joe, it would return 6, 5 for hi Joe and 1 for the space. The other string manipulation function is substring. This command returns some of the characters in the string, and it has the following structure. Substring brackets the string you want to check, the start character, and how many characters do you want back from that start character. So if we use substring hello, comma 1, comma 1, that means start with the first character of hello and return 1 character back. So this is going to give us H. If we use substring goodbye 5, comma 3, it will start with the 5th character, which is B, and then it will return 3 back from it. So BYE will be returned back. Now, this is a quick way for you to extract parts of a string. For example, you might be given a username and password together, and you could use a substring to remove the username part and the password part. And then you can compare it using a selection and do something with it. Of course, you can do some quite complex manipulation using both of these types of functions. Now, there's some code on screen. You can pause the video to study it, but we're going to go through a walkthrough of it. So we're going to ask the user to enter a message and we're going to store it in string input. We're going to use a for loop to count from the first character to the length of the string input. So if the string input variable had 10 characters in it, then it'll be 1 to 10. If it had 50, then it'll be 1 to 50. We're then going to use the substring function to assign a value to the character variable, and we're going to extract each character at a time. Now we can also do multiple characters, which is the next example. We take the string input and then we're going to create a new string, which is going to use the substring functions to split the string input, and we're going to take length of the actual string. So if it's 10 characters long, we're going to subtract 3. So that means it becomes 7. And from the 7th character, we're going to return the 3 characters back. So it allows us to get the last 3 characters out from any particular string. So do pause the video to understand how both these functions work and how we can manipulate these two functions, create complex extractions from a piece of string. In the exam, you could be asked anything for extraction, so you need to really understand how these two functions work. We also have two other functions called upper and lower, and these are used to convert a string into uppercase or lowercase. And these both are very simple to use. So when you say upper hello, that returns capital hellos. When you say lower hello, that returns lowercase hello. And you can use a string or a variable with upper and lower as well. Okay, let's look at nested statements. A nested statement is one or more selection or iteration statements inside another selection or iteration statement. So on screen, you see an example where we're using a for loop, and then within a for loop, we've nested an if statement. And this allows us to create quite complex structures. For example, we're going to use a loop that runs around 100 times, and then we're going to enter a number and check if this number is greater than 10. And if it's greater than 10, we increment the more than 10 counter. If it's equal to 10, then we increment the equal to 10 counter. Now this allows for us to use multiple counters instead of creating multiple loops dedicated to each counter. Okay, let's look at subroutines now. A subroutine is a self-contained piece of code that has a name or an identifier, and it can be called from anywhere in the main program. Now, subroutines are useful because they reduce code. You write the subroutine once, you test it, and then you can call it as many times as you need to. This saves us from rewriting the code every time, and it increases the reusability of the code. So each time we rewrite it, there's a chance of an error. So if we write it once and check it, we can then call it again, and this reduces the chances of errors occurring. Now, there are two types of subroutines, procedures and functions, and you need to be aware of the difference between both. A function always returns a value back to the main program. A procedure does not return a value. So let's start by looking at procedures. Now, procedures can, just like functions, take one or more values as parameters. And what do we mean by parameters? That means the main program can send some values to this procedure, and we can then use those values to do something. Let's look at the example on screen. Procedure output 1 to 10. In this case, there are no parameters entered. Why? Because the brackets to this procedure are empty. So the header statement procedure output 1 to 10 has no parameters in the brackets. If you wanted to put parameters, you'd probably add them there. We'll look at that later. So for count 1 to 10, we're going to output count. This is our simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But instead of doing it again and again in every program, we're going to create this subroutine called output 1 to 10. And then whenever we want to count from 1 to 10, we're going to use the command word call to call the output 1 to 10 procedure. And whenever it's called, it's going to just simply output 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, whenever you're calling a procedure, just make sure you have the call command word at the front and the brackets at the end. And if you've got any parameters, they need to go inside the brackets. So let's have a quick look at functions as well. A function returns a value to the program that called it. This can either be by using the return command in capitals or saving a value to the function's identifier. Now, once the value is returned, the function stops running. So it can't have any other code after the return part because it will not be executed. Now on screen, you see the structure, which looks the same as the procedure. Function identifier, whatever code you want to run, then return the value and end function. Just like a procedure, make sure you have the end procedure or end function at the end of the function part. Otherwise, you will not get a mark in the exam. So when a function is called, it normally returns a value. So we need to do something with the value. We can either output it directly or we could save it in a variable. So when we call functions, we don't use the command word call. We simply output it or we save it to a particular variable. So what do we mean by that? So if you look at the function on screen, which is multiply, it doesn't have any parameters in the header statement. So we're going to get the user to input two numbers, and we're going to simply return the multiplication of those two numbers. But this multiplication either would need to be stored or output. So we can say output brackets multiply two brackets because it's a function, and that will just return the result back to the main program and output it straight away. We can also store the return results, and in this case, we're going to store the results for a function called total values in a variable called total. So we say total is assigned the return result of total values function, brackets at the end because it's a function just like a procedure, and the function total values initializes total to 0, does a loop of 50, adds the values from an array into that total, and then returns the total once the loop is finished back to the main program. And that value is stored in the total variable. Now this leads us to the scope of a variable because we saw total being used inside the function and outside the function. If a variable is used inside a function and not outside the function, it's called a local variable. If it's used in the main program and inside a function, it's called a global variable. And you can declare a variable or a constant or an array as global. That means it can be accessed by various functions and procedures, or you can declare them as local. That means they will be used just within a function or a procedure. If you look at the example on screen, global data means the data is now a global variable. So it's going to be used within a procedure and outside of a procedure as well. So the procedure output data just simply outputs whatever the value of data is. And in the main program, we can assign the value of data to 1. We're going to then output this data variable, which should output 1 on screen. Then we're going to call output data, and output data procedure will also output data. That means you're going to have two ones on screen, one from the output data and one from the results of the procedure. And the reason we did that is to check if the values match. Now you can declare a variable as local. That means it can only be accessed in the part of the code where it's declared. And normally we can declare it in the function or procedure header statement. In this example, the procedure output data, we're declaring a local variable called data parameter of the type integer. And this data parameter is then incremented by 1, and then we output this data parameter out. So our main program now looks like this. Data is assigned the value 1, and we output this data variable, which is then outputting 1 on screen. We're then calling output data, and we're passing this original data value, which now is 1, to the procedure. The procedure stores this data in a variable called data parameter. It then increments that, so it becomes 2, and then it outputs data parameter, which is 2. So the original data variable contains 1, and this data parameter, which is output, contains 2. So we haven't changed the original variable, we've just used a copy of it by assigning it to a local data parameter variable. Now, since we're mentioning the name parameters, what are parameters? A parameter is a value that is sent from the main program to a subroutine, a procedure, or a function. They're normally in the brackets in the header statement, which has the procedure's name. So procedure total has two variables, num1 and num2, passed to it, and then it's going to be using those variables to do something. So when we call this particular procedure, we're going to say call total, and in the brackets, when we're calling it, we have to add these two numbers in. So that means that 1 and 2 will be passed into that procedure or function, and then you can do something with it. Okay, that's all there is to the basic pseudocode side of things. You will need to be able to manipulate pseudocode to create solutions, and that requires a lot of practice. For that, I would probably suggest you need to focus on past paper exam questions. Hopefully, you know enough to answer the following questions. You should be able to explain the difference between a function and a procedure. You should also be able to explain what type of loop would be most appropriate if a loop has to run 50 times. You should be able to write a procedure to take 3 numbers as parameters and output the largest. You should be able to write a function that takes 2 strings as parameters. It takes the first 3 characters of each string, combines them, and then returns the resulting string back to the main program. You should also be able to write program statements to call procedures, for example, the one that we wrote in question 3. And you should also be able to store the result of a function, for example, that one in question 4, in perhaps a variable called concat, and then output this particular variable. Problems like that are going to be part of your paper 2 exam. So if you do have any questions about these, please get back to me in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.